Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I would like to remind you that tomorrow at noon, Henry Levin will be speaking on schooling and the American dream in the Pioneer Room, and tomorrow night at 8 in the Sunroom, Jack Stack will be speaking on the great game of business. Following tonight's presentation, there will be a reception in the Campanile Room, and everyone is welcome to attend. This evening's speaker has co-authored America, What Went Wrong with James Steele. They are investigative reporters for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where they have collaborated for several years, winning 2 Pulitzer Prizes and every major national journalism award. Other books they have written include Empire, The Life, Legend, and Madness of Howard Hughes, and Forevermore, Nuclear Waste in America. It is my pleasure to introduce Don Bartlett.
I'm not sure how this is going to go. We just had a rather rowdy dinner with Pat Miller and the students here. One of the unusual experiences when we did this book was filming the 2 shows with Bill Moyers. It's something we've never done before, and it was fascinating to watch that process. And it was also kind of interesting to watch the way people responded, especially at the newspaper where we work. And the program's got extraordinary reviews around the country. The papers everywhere recommended that people watch the 2 shows. And the Inquirer did also, but they were a little less charitable to us. The Inquirer TV critic on the day of the show, Rand said that on the TV personality scale, Bartlett and Steele are so laid back as to be almost completely horizontal. Steele did something to this guy, I don't know what it was at some point. And then he goes on and he says at one point, Bartlett gets so outraged that he actually arches an eyebrow. And then he ended this is our own newspaper, by the way. He ends the review by saying the 2 of them are Clark Kentish enough to make Bill Moyers look like Morton Downey Jr., in which we immediately sent a fax to Moyers inviting him to join in some litigation against our TV critic. But unfortunately, one of our lawyer friends pointed out that truth remains an absolute defense in libel, and it would be best to forget the whole thing. So we kind of dropped it. The book received generally very, very favorable reviews and a very positive response. There was some very heated criticism of it. And it came mostly from the financial press community and real conservative organizations. But the reviews were also kind of mixed. The Wall Street Journal got so exercised, they devoted about 3/4 of the editorial page to a kind of a personal attack on us, in which they described us as the Sister Souljah of economic populism. But then another national magazine came out a month later and said that we wrote about economics the way Bruce Springsteen sings about economics. So we had this real contrast. I'm not sure who we are. Business Week said that we were obsessed with fairness in the tax system, which we plead guilty to, and that the book was a polemic. And the Chicago Sun-Times, on the other hand, said, though Democratic presidential candidates Bill Clinton and Jerry Brown are quoting Bartlett and Steele in the campaign trail, this book is no polemic. And so you have this rather contradictory reviews in which somebody is looking at the book as a polemic and somebody says it's not a polemic. And how do you account for this? And the explanation is very simple. If you're in that 15% at the top of the income scale, and we use tax return data as opposed to any other, if you're in that 15% top of those tax return filers, you probably think things are going very well to extraordinarily well. If you're in that other 85%, you probably know there's something wrong. And the series and the book were really written from the perspective of that 85%. And when the series ran, the response was just extraordinary. Jim and I have worked together for 22 years now, and we've always gotten a very strong response from all of our series. The Enquirer reprints them usually it's usually within 2 to 3 weeks after a series is finished. The Enquirer reprints them and makes them available. And Max King this time said the editor said he wanted to have the reprints available the day after the series ended, which was a first and a real achievement in a way. And the series ended on Monday, and on Tuesday afternoon we got a call from one of the security guards who's an old friend, and he said, "You need to come down to the lobby to see what's happening." And they had to call out extra security guards just because of the crowds in the lobby. And it was just an incredible response. The original 18,000 reprints were gone in 2 days, and then the paper ultimately went to 400,000, and then the book. But the most extraordinary thing was the response from ordinary people. We received so far more than 25,000 letters. And these letters come from across all racial lines, all economic lines, all social lines. They're not coming from just people who are hurting, they're coming from people who are very well off, but recognize that there is something wrong in the society and something needs to be fixed. And there were, I think, out of 25,000, you can pick any number of letters, but there were two that I kind of think represent these two extremes of people. And one was just a couple of sentences, really, from a woman in Asheville, North Carolina. Just a really nice comment on the book, and she ended it with this. She said, "If I were financially able, I would like to present a copy of your book to each family of my small church with the inscription, read, and then pass on." This was clearly from someone down at the bottom of that income scale. The other letter came from an executive, a high-level executive of an insurance company here in the Midwest, someone who was doing very well. And it was a 3-page typewritten letter. And he said, "I wish I could find a seed of optimism in your book, but I haven't yet." In response to a question at the press club, Mr. Bartlett said that you too were short-term pessimists and long-term optimists. Can we really effectively change the structural defects in our economy and society? Can we throw the people out and really change things like the entrenched bureaucracy, the ludicrous tax code, the healthcare delivery system, the banking system, the education system before it's too late? I don't have to tell you the division between the haves and the have-nots is widening daily. People are getting angry and desperate. Desperate people commit acts of desperation. As you have said, things will probably get worse before they get better. But do we have the time? Do we have the intelligence and the leadership to make the necessary changes happen? Can we rewrite the rule book? That letter, and we received a number of letters like that from affluent people who are deeply concerned by what they see is happening in the country. And they see what is happening to their own children or their grandchildren. And in some ways that letter goes to the heart of one of the questions posed in the program, in the statement of purpose for this program. Will society continue to splinter, or can we find a way to live and work in constructive coalition? And what we see happening out there now as we crisscross the country interviewing people for the series and in the years since then is that we're creating a kind of economic Yugoslavia out here in which we're pitting one group against another, pitting the old against the young, whites against blacks, blacks against Asians, people with health care against people without health care, people with pensions against people without pensions. When the original series ran, the first group that we heard from, we couldn't understand why, were psychologists and psychiatrists. We got a number of telephone calls. Why are we hearing from these people in particular? You know, a friend who's a social worker a long time psychologist in Western Pennsylvania, and I called him and asked him, and he had read this series, and he said, it's very simple. He said, through the 1970s and the 1980s, my caseload consisted basically of people with alcohol or drug problems or family problems growing out of one of those two conditions. But he said in the last 2 years, my caseload has exploded, and it is all as a result of one phenomenon. He said these are middle-class people who have achieved their lifestyle by virtue of the fact that both the husband and the wife worked. One of the two has lost their job, and they now see their lives unraveling before them. And he said that the husband is taking it out on the wife's taking it out on the husband, and both are taking it out on the children, and that from a social worker standpoint, it's the worst possible situation to be in because there's nothing that I can do about it. He said I can sympathize with them and I can tell them what is happening is not their fault, but the only thing that's going to solve their problem is a job, and there are no jobs out there. Another newspaper came into Philadelphia last year and looked at an elementary school in suburban Philadelphia, in Bucks County. It's an elementary school that serves the Levittown area, and also near the U.S. Steel plant, which really created the growth of Levittown, Pennsylvania back in the 1950s. I'll point out here, by the way, it's one of the yardsticks we use to show what's happening out there is Levittown, which was a symbol of upward mobility through the 50s and 60s in Pennsylvania. The people who had never owned a home before were able to buy one. It took a factory worker in 1952 one day to pay the closing costs in a Levittown house. It now takes a factory worker 19 weeks to pay the closing costs on the same Levittown house, and he can't afford to buy it without a second income. But the paper went and looked at this elementary school where, for the first time, subsidized lunches had reached 40% of the student body. This is a school where a few years before subsidized lunches were unknown. And there are a number of students quoted in the story. I'm going to read two of them. One is a fourth grade boy, and he's describing his home life this way. And he says, sometimes I can't concentrate thinking about my dad and wondering if he'll ever get a job. When my mother comes home from work, she asks my dad what he did. And he tells her, and then she says, that's all you did? I always talk to my sister when they're fighting. And the other one is a fourth grade girl, described her home life this way. My real dad and my stepdad are both laid off. My dad has been trying to find a job for 6 months, but nobody will hire him. I think he's going to move to another area. My dad collects business cards, but he can't leave his number with anybody because he doesn't have a phone. He tries to visit places to look for work, but he doesn't always have gas money. We don't go anywhere. We don't have any money now. There's quite another picture that emerges out of Washington, in certain areas of the country. If you look at what economists are saying, you get a totally different view. And this is especially true in the last few weeks. But these are people who are looking at charts and graphs and statistics in isolation, and they are not looking at human beings. But it's important to put in context what they were saying a couple of years ago and what they're saying now. And we always like to put things in a historical perspective. If you go back to January 30th, 1990, Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, appears before the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. And he's telling Congress why there basically is little likelihood there's going to be a recession. And this is his quote, in part: favorable signs about the economy's economic health are revealed by comparing recent movements in an index of leading economic indicators with its pattern of movements just before and during previous recessions. The resulting measure suggests the probability of a recession developing in the next 6 months increased last spring to almost 30%, but according to the most recent estimates has declined to about 20%. The next month, he tells the House Banking Subcommittee, this is February 1990, available indicators of near-term economic performance suggest the weakest point may have passed. From these and similar economic data, one can infer the beginnings of a modest firming in economic activity. July 1990, he tells the Senate Banking Committee, on balance, the economy still appears to be growing and the likelihood of a near-term recession seems low. That's the point at which the recession had already begun, but the economists didn't see it yet. In January 1991, he's before the House Budget Committee, and he says now, all indicators are that business activity declined appreciably in the fourth quarter of 1990. Now the indicators are showing the session is officially underway. February 1991, Michael Boskin, the Council of Economic Advisors, says that the downturn in the U.S. economy in the latter part of 1990 does not signal any decline in its long-run underlying health or basic vitality. Several factors suggest the economic downturn is not likely to last long and a recovery will begin by the middle of 1991. July 91, Greenspan again. I think the evidence is increasing week by week. The bottom is passed and the economy is beginning to move up. And then a story in February 1992 from the front page of the New York Times, which carried the headline, "Why Mainstream Economists Expect a Recovery This Time." And then a week later, this story, page 1, this headline, "Layoffs Called No Big Threat to Recovery." And that story began this way. This is page 1 of the New York Times. Although many of the country's biggest companies have announced plans to cut staggering numbers of employees, economists say the layoffs alone do not add up to a threat that could demolish the chances for an economic recovery this year. And down in the story, these two paragraphs. The tens of thousands of layoffs can certainly be swallowed up in a nationwide labor market of 109 million payroll jobs and several thousand self-employed when the economic cycle turns up. Quote, the economy is quite capable of accommodating large amounts of people being laid off, said Stephen Davis, an economist at the University of Chicago. All of these people are talking about indexes and measuring devices, and they are not talking about human beings. But this isn't the first time this has happened. And I think it's worth putting what you're reading in the papers today, in which everything now seems to be going very well. The gross national product is growing, productivity is increasing, everything is fine. You need to put those analyses in context with another time. Now, I'd like to read you some of those quotes from an earlier era. And the date is October 15th, 1929. And The Economist is Irving Fisher, a very prominent Yale University economist, who at that time was quoted as widely in the news media as Alan Greenspan is today. And he met with a group of businessmen in a Park Avenue club. And he told them that he, quote, expected to see the stock market a good deal higher than it is today within a few months. The following day, after Fisher assured leading businessmen that the stock market was going to go up, Charles Mitchell, the president of National City Bank, who was the most prominent banker of the day, sent a cablegram to Bernard Baruch. Baruch had been out of the country in Scotland and felt that something was going on, but he didn't know what. And he was querying different people, Mitchell among them, for their advice. You know, what is happening with the economy? And Mitchell sends back this cablegram to Baruch. General situation looks exceptionally sound with very few bad spots. I doubt if anything that will not affect business can affect the market, which is like a weather vane pointing into a gale of prosperity. A week later, October 25th, President Hoover issues the statement that the fundamental business of the country, the production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. That same day, the Wall Street Journal reported that, quote, Treasury officials say the fluctuations of the stock market do not reflect general business conditions. Profits from businesses are still strong and increasing regularly. The action of the market is due to technical conditions rather than general business. And if you want to think about newspapers for a while, that was the same Wall Street Journal which a year before had this to say about the election of Mr. Hoover. He said, the job of the Coolidge administration has been to clear the tracks of obstacles and obstructions which threaten to block the progress of the business engine. The Hoover administration is likely to be one which will show the engineer the way to attain greater speed with safety. There has never been a president with a fundamental understanding of economics better than Mr. Hoover. There has never been a president who has had his capacity of large-scale organization to get things accomplished. There is no rift in the loop in sight. Anyway, on October 26, 1929, the Washington Post carried this story. President Hoover has taken timely and wholesome action by informing the people that the fundamental business conditions of the country are sound. No man or woman who is working and not speculating has any cause to worry. Never have so many been so wrong with such disastrous consequences for everyone else. And as I indicated, one of the reasons we like to do this in a historical sense is so that when you read the day's newspapers and you see how well things are going, and the measurements are in terms of gross domestic product and productivity indexes, you might want to worry a little bit about it. One of the economists who was very critical of the series in the book issued a kind of a report, and in it he said, because we make the argument that the country is systematically deindustrializing, and he wrote this, did the country deindustrialize? Hardly. The Federal Reserve's overall industrial production index rose in line with GNP by 29% between January 1980 and September 1990. Contrary to all the predictions of the demise of U.S. manufacturing, the manufacturing index rose both absolutely and relatively by 37% during the same period. Notice the reliance on indexes. If you go back to the 1920s, you will see the same reliance in the productivity index of the 1920s. It had no relationship to what was happening to people. We don't generally trash economists as a group. There are a lot of well-meaning economists out there and people who are very supportive of the book. But the problem is there are a lot of economists who create government policies basically in response to indexes or theories rather than in response to human needs. Let me give you an example of a couple of numbers. When you look at that manufacturing base, and you go back to the 1950s, 34% of the U.S. workforce was employed in manufacturing, people who made things with their hands, 15.2 million people. In the 70s, that figure rose, the total number of people in manufacturing rose to 19 million. In 1980, it rose on average to 20 million. But in each of those decades, the overall percentage of the workforce fell to 27 and then to 22%. And you can make an argument that which has a lot of validity to it, that this is good, that we were making more and better products with fewer people. That's good. But then you come to 1992, and you have 18.2 million people employed in manufacturing, same level as in 1965. Only now, it's only 16.8% of the workforce. But there's another more significant number, and that is that last year, for the first year in this country's history, there were more people employed in local, state, and federal government than in manufacturing. That's not possible to continue. Somebody has to pay the bills. There are now, from January through November, 400,000 more government employees than manufacturing employees. And today's Inquirer, in the plane I was reading on the way out, the governor of Pennsylvania just released his budget. Pennsylvania state government employment will increase another 2,000 this year. And where will those people work? In 5 new prisons that are being built. The budgets for all state education institutions will be flat, as they have been for the last year. You know, they indicated it's really good that we can produce more products with fewer people. But what is being missed and what's happening out there is that more and more people are being forced into ever lower paying jobs. They are losing part or all of their health care benefits. They are losing part or all of their pensions. And some of these moves have been as a result of deliberate government policies. And others are, the catchphrase of the day is to be competitive in a global economy. And I'll read you a quote from one financial publication dealing with Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana. And it quoted the chief executive. He was talking about employment at Cummins. And he said, "We've got a much reduced workforce, and all the people we're bringing to work here start at $7.50 an hour. It's clear that to be competitive in the world sense, particularly if you're an exporter like we are in Caterpillar, is you have to have world costs. We've had a 60% reduction in cost per person here at Cummins. We pay far less for shop floor work than we did 10 years ago." But what is happening out there goes way beyond manufacturing, and that's what has set apart what is happening in the economy today with the 70s, when in the Rust Belt era. And that is, you see now the same thing in the service economy. If you go back and look at airlines prior to deregulation, prior to 1978, there had never been a bankruptcy of a scheduled airliner in this country. Never in history. I picked up a copy of 1984 Fortune the other day and looked at the top 50 transportation companies. Number 7 on that list was Eastern Airlines, 37,000 workers. Eastern, of course, went bankrupt and no longer exists. Number 8 on the list was Pan American with 28,000 employees, bankrupt, no longer exists. Number 10 on the list, Trans World Airlines with 26,000 employees. It's in bankruptcy court, and pieces have been sold off and are continuing to be sold off. Number 12 on the list is Northwest Airlines, which is in the process of laying off workers and has canceled its orders for new planes, as have most of the other airlines. And then there was Braniff Airlines, which was in bankruptcy 3 times and no longer exists. And so now to prop up the ailing domestic U.S. industry, you have KLM Royal Dutch buying a portion of Northwest, British Airways buying a portion of U.S. Air, and you have stewardesses in some area who qualify for food stamps. wanted to talk about two people, basically, or three people we met in the course of this project who really are kind of reflective of what's happening out there. They worked for a department store called Hex. It was based in Charleston, West Virginia. Hex was started in 1959 by a group of businessmen in Charleston. And at the end of the first year, it was so successful they opened a second store and continued to open stores thereafter. And they did it the old-fashioned way. They did it with retained earnings. In other words, they took the profits and plowed them back into the business and opened new stores. They did not borrow money. And as the years went by, they built up to a chain of about 170 stores and 7,000 employees. And it was an interesting chain because they provided a pension for their workers, and they provided full health care benefits, and they relied largely on full-time workers, not part-time workers as most department stores do today. But at any rate, the owner sold, new management comes in, it's the middle of the 1980s, and you have a new mindset in which you borrow a lot of money, do a lot of expansion, and then you realize you've spent too much money and you can't pay the interest. And so what happens? The new management begins to lay off people. And the first one of the first was Mrs. Bobby Jean McLaughlin. She had worked at Hex for 18 years. And she was making $6.20 an hour. $13,000 a year, managing the cosmetics department. And they called her in one day and told her job was terminated. She had to be out of the store by noon. And she asked them, she said, well, isn't there something else I could do at a lower level because I really need the health care benefits? And they said, no, we have to terminate your job. And the health care was very important to her because her husband had emphysema. He had worked for 30 years in a small bakery in Charleston and had developed a really severe case. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, and when I went down to West Virginia to begin interviewing these people, I knew it was going to be difficult. West Virginians have a reputation of being clannish, which I don't think is quite right. They're just very private people and very decent people. And when I called her the first time, she wanted to think about it. She was a little reluctant. And when I called back and got her husband, he was extremely upbeat, and he said, come over to the house, be happy to. And I had a little trouble understanding him, but I didn't think anything about it. And he gave me the directions. They lived in a hollow, and it's hard to envision a hollow in Iowa, but a hollow, you got to have these mountains, but a hollow begins sometimes as a 2-lane road and paved, often a dirt road, but it quickly narrows into 1 lane, and then there are little places you pull off so that oncoming cars can go by, and there are no house numbers. You identify the house as the 3rd house past the blue house, past the 3 barking dogs. And when I got there and he invited me into the house, I saw why I had trouble understanding him. He was connected to an a ventilating machine by basically an umbilical cord, which allowed him to walk through the ranch, the very modest ranch home that they lived in, the bedroom and the kitchen and the bathroom. And he was an extremely upbeat person. He was connected to that machine 24 hours a day. And he really convinced his wife to talk about the job and what happened, and she did. I went back again to see them in the fall. It was August or September. And in December I called her, and he had died. In the interim, when she had lost her job and he died, there was $26,000 in medical bills run up with no health insurance. The bakery he worked at was too small, couldn't afford it. And up until the time she lost her job at Hex, the insurance policy there covered all the medical problems. She said, I talked to her not too long ago, and she still gets telephone calls from the bill collector for the hospital asking to speak to her husband, who he knows is dead, but as a harassing device to try to get her to pay the $26,000 in medical bills. It took her months to find a job, and this is someone who has worked all her life. We have 6 children, 6 grandchildren. She was very proud of the fact when I first met him, she said, all of our children finished school. And when you're in West Virginia, you realize she's not talking college, she's talking high school, and that's an enormous achievement. But it took her a long time to find another job. But she finally did at the bakery where he worked at minimum wage with $26,000 in medical bills. The second woman was Patsy Perry, also worked at Hex. She earned $5.60 an hour. These wages are important when you read newspaper stories talking about the high-paid American workers. There are workers in this country who do very well. There are tens of millions of workers who are working at salaries like this. She lost her job at the same time, and she needed the medical benefits too because she had diabetes and a lot of health problems. She got a job at a convenience store, which did have health insurance, but when she went into the hospital for a hysterectomy, she lost her job, canceled her health care benefits, and she wound up with thousands of dollars in health care bills. And she subsequently found a job in another discount store, minimum wage. And she sent us a letter not too long ago saying, I'm just getting by, but that's about all any of us do these days. I get around 30 hours a week at $4.75 an hour. That's less than $8,000 a year. I still have my insurance and will if I can average at least 28 hours a week. But her medical bills are, from the time when she had no insurance, are still unpaid. The third person is Molly James, who worked at a Universal manufacturing plant in Paterson, New Jersey for 30 years. When the plant was shut down, and part of the operations moved to Mexico, and she lost her job, she was earning $7.91 an hour. Once again, though, it was the medical benefits that she had then that she doesn't have now, and now she has cataracts, and she owns her own home. She held 2 jobs through most of her working life to buy that house, and now she has an option. She can cash in her house, pay the medical bills that she will run up, or she can wait it out until she qualifies for Medicare some years from now. I don't know if some of you undoubtedly have read a short story called The Lottery, and some of you probably haven't. It was written by Shirley Jackson back in 1948, and I heartily recommend this short story, not only because Shirley Jackson was an amazing storyteller, but it really has, I think, some message in it for us today. And basically this is a story about a small town in which they have a lottery. And the whole beginning of the short story is the build-up to the lottery. And she's talking about all the townspeople gathering in the town square. This is an annual event. And she describes it this way. She says, the lottery was conducted as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called. A little late today, folks. The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. And she goes on for a few pages describing the events leading up to the selection, to the drawing from this box to pick the winners of the lottery. And the first drawing is to select the winning family, and then when the winning family is selected, the members of the family draw to see who wins the lottery. And it's when you get to that point in the short story, and really not till then, you realize that this is a lottery you don't want to win. And the winning family is the Hutchinson family. And this is what she wrote, is the members of the Hutchinson family go up to take out the slip of paper from the box to see which one has the coal marking on it as the winner. The children and the parents all take part on it. And the first one is the little boy, Davy, put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry," that's Harry's father, "you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it up, while little Dave stood next to him and looked at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet over large, nearly knocked over the box as he got a paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. "Bill," Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." And it goes on to describe each one opens the papers, and it's finally clear that Tessie, the mother, has won the lottery. But she hasn't opened her hand to show the paper, and her husband goes over to his wife and forced the slip out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said, "let's finish quickly." Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones in the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her in the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. And that's the way the story ends, with the village stoning to death the winner of the lottery. When the New Yorker published that short story in 1948, it drew the largest volume of mail the magazine had received in its history. And basically people had two questions, one of two questions. Was this just an incredible Gothic horror story? Or was Shirley Jackson suggesting that beneath the surface of all of us is a very dark side? And the New Yorker naturally, and Shirley Jackson naturally never answered that question, but I think the critics over the years clearly came down on the latter answer. But when you read that short story and you think, well, it's very powerful, and you finish and you say, well, no civilized society is going to conduct a lottery and then stone someone to death. It doesn't, no civilized society is going to do it. But I'll leave you with this question. What kind of a civilized society is it that says if I work for a company that pays all of my health insurance, that any medical bills I have will be paid for and I need have no concerns at all? But if a woman working for a department store in West Virginia loses her job through no fault of her own, she has lost the lottery and she's out of luck. It's a question I think we all really need to think a lot about. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions or deal with other areas. Or
What you're reading on Bill Clinton from watching the campaign, your book seems to say the problems on both sides of the aisle. Help the case in this case.
I don't know. You're already reading all the stories on the deficit. You're going to be reading these stories for months.